Lancaster Concert Hall, Chicago, December 22nd, 2025, 8:47 p.m. The chandeliers scattered light like fallen stars across 500 upturned faces. Each crystal prism caught the glow from overhead spots and threw it back in fragments, gold, white, silver, until the entire space seemed to breathe with its own luminescence. The air held that peculiar silence that comes before music begins, heavy with anticipation, and the collective held breath of witnesses who sensed they were about to see something extraordinary. Phones glowed in the darkness like fireflies. Recording, waiting. Everyone knew they were about to witness history, though few understood exactly what kind. At center stage, a Steinway Model D grand piano waited in perfect stillness. 9 feet of black lacquer and precision engineering worth $187,000. Under the stage lights, its surface became a pool of liquid darkness, reflecting the man who approached it with measured steps. Elijah Cross was 36 years old. He moved with the quiet dignity of someone who had learned to carry pain without advertising it. His skin was dark brown, catching the stage lights in subtle gradations of warmth. Short cropped black hair, neat and close cut. Athletic build beneath the elegant black suit that fit him perfectly because Sophia Lancaster had insisted on Savile Row tailoring, refusing to let him wear anything less for this moment. But it was his hands that told the real story. His right hand carried scars, surgical marks webbing across the palm like frozen lightning captured in flesh. Tissue that had been crushed under 1,247 pounds of stage equipment 13 years ago and rebuilt through 127 hours of surgery across 3 operations. The scar tissue caught the light differently than healthy skin. Smoother, shinier, stretched too tight over reconstructed bones and grafted nerves that would never work quite right again. Beside him walked his daughter. Maya Cross was 7 years old. Her skin was a shade lighter than her father's, inheriting some of her late mother's complexion, that beautiful brown that looked like honey held up to sunlight. Dark hair pulled back into careful braids decorated with colorful beads that clicked softly as she moved, creating a gentle percussion that only she and her father could hear. She wore a blue satin dress that caught the stage lights when she turned, creating small constellations of reflected brilliance across the front rows. Her eyes, warm brown like her father's, held no fear. Only trust and love, and a child's unshakable certainty that her daddy could do anything if he just tried hard enough. Stage right, standing in the wings where the audience could see her clearly. Sophia Lancaster watched with tears already streaming down her face. 34 years old, white skin that held a California tan even in December's depths. Honey blonde hair swept back in an elegant updo that had taken her stylist an hour to perfect that afternoon. The crimson dress she wore was the same one from the Christmas party exactly 1 year ago. A deliberate choice, a closing of the circle, a statement that she was not the same woman who'd worn it then. Diamonds at her throat and wrists caught the light and threw it back in sharp flashes worth more than most people earned in a year. But none of that mattered compared to her eyes. Ice blue, people called them. Cold and calculating in boardrooms and negotiations, able to make grown men with corner offices nervous with a single glance. But right now they were warm with tears and something that looked like wonder mixed with grief and joy, and the kind of love that comes from truly seeing someone for the first time after years of looking past them. She was the CEO of Lancaster Capital Group, worth $312 million on paper, commanded rooms with a glance, made decisions that affected thousands of lives and hundreds of millions of dollars. And she was crying in public, completely unashamed, because the man walking toward that piano had written her a love song 16 years ago. when he was a poor black kid washing dishes to afford music camp, and she had never known until now. Had spent 16 years believing someone else had written it. Someone else had loved her that completely. Someone else had given her the one beautiful thing she'd carried through her mother's death and her father's cruelty and every lonely night that followed. The crowd murmured softly. 500 people in formal wear holding programs printed on expensive cardstock phones already out and recording because everyone sensed this would be something worth capturing. They'd come for a benefit concert, a scholarship fund announcement, the usual charity event that wealthy Chicagoans attended to feel good about themselves and network with other wealthy Chicagoans. They had no idea they were about to witness a love story 16 years in the making, a criminal arrest, and a man playing piano with hands that shouldn't work anymore. Elijah helped Maya onto a small bench positioned beside the piano bench. She settled herself with the elaborate seriousness of someone performing an important task. Her small hands smoothing her dress, her feet dangling because they didn't quite reach the floor even from the elevated bench. He sat beside her, adjusted the bench height with a smooth motion that spoke of muscle memory and decades of practice. Positioned his hands over the keys, left hand steady and confident, right hand trembling almost imperceptibly. The trembling wasn't fear. It was nerve damage, permanent, a reminder of the price he'd paid 13 years ago for being in the wrong place at the right time to save someone else's life. The hall fell completely silent. Even the rustling of programs stopped. Even the whispered conversations died. Then the rear doors opened. Not softly. Federal agents don't do soft entrances when they want everyone to know they're there. 3 men in dark suits entered with the kind of purposeful movement that speaks of authority and legal weight and consequences about to rain down on someone. FBI, their badges said, though most people in the audience couldn't see them from this distance. They could only see 3 men with guns holstered at their hips and handcuffs ready at their belts approaching someone in the 3rd row with the inevitability of a thunderstorm. Garrett Blackwell sat 3rd row center aisle seat. Premium location that he'd paid extra for, wanting to be close to Sophia, wanting to watch what he assumed would be her humiliation when this concert, this ridiculous charity project named after her janitor boyfriend, inevitably failed to impress the people who mattered. He was 35 years old, white with perfectly styled chestnut brown hair that cost $200 a month to maintain at a salon in the Gold Coast that didn't serve people like Elijah Cross. Clean-shaven jaw that suggested good genetics and expensive skincare. Tailored navy suit worth $3,400, Italian silk tie. Swiss watch on his wrist that cost $47,000 more than Elijah earned annually working maintenance. The kind of man who measured worth in quarterly returns and spoke about human beings as assets to be optimized and human capital requiring strategic deployment. He'd been Sophia's fiancé until 10 months ago. Had planned to marry her in 6 weeks, merge their companies, and use Lancaster Capital's accounts to hide the $42.3 million he'd stolen from his own investment fund over the course of 18 months of systematic fraud. He'd been very careful, used shell companies in the Cayman Islands, fabricated asset valuations to hide the losses, covered his tracks with the skill of someone who'd been planning this theft for 2 full years, waiting for the right opportunity, the right mark, the right moment to execute. But he hadn't counted on Sophia's assistant being smarter than he was, or on Sophia choosing integrity over $200 million in merger value, or on the FBI being patient enough to wait until the perfect moment, this moment with 500 witnesses and cameras recording everything for maximum impact. Garrett saw the agents approaching. His face went through a rapid series of changes, confusion as he noticed them, recognition as he understood why they were there. terror as he realized his carefully constructed world was about to collapse, rage as he decided to go down fighting. He stood, tried to run toward the side exit, got exactly 3 steps before the lead agent caught his arm. With professional efficiency, spun him around, began reading Miranda rights in a voice deliberately pitched to carry to the balcony. Garrett Blackwell, you are under arrest for wire fraud, embezzlement of $42.3 million, securities fraud, and conspiracy to defraud investors. The handcuffs clicked with a sound that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden, shocked silence. Garrett's voice cracked like ice under pressure, rising from controlled anger to desperate shouting in the space of 3 seconds. "This is her fault!" He couldn't point with his hands cuffed behind his back, so he jerked his chin toward Sophia like a man trying to headbutt the air. "She destroyed me. She chose him over everything we built, over $200 million. His voice rose to a shout that echoed off the concert hall's acoustically perfect walls. "For a janitor, a nobody, The agent's hand on his arm tightened. "Sir, you need to stop talking." But Garrett was beyond stopping. "This is a setup. She's manufacturing evidence because she's having some kind of emotional breakdown. Because she developed an obsession with the help. You're arresting the wrong person. She's the one who should be." The agents walked him toward the exit with professional indifference to his protests. Garrett fought them with words, since his hands were bound, threats about lawsuits and lawyers and connections, promises of revenge and exposure, the desperate soundtrack of a man watching his kingdom burn to ash while he could do nothing but scream. The doors closed behind him with a hollow boom that seemed to vibrate in everyone's chests. Silence rushed back in like water filling a hole. Every eye in the hall turned back to the stage, to the man sitting at the piano with his daughter beside him, waiting with a patience that suggested he'd learned long ago that rushing only breaks things. Elijah's scarred right hand moved to the keys. 500 people held their breath. The first notes emerged like rain beginning to fall, gentle, tentative, each drop distinct before the deluge. A melody that seemed to materialize from nowhere, building itself note by note into something recognizable, something that reached into the chest and squeezed. The piece was called Midnight Sonata. Elijah had written it 16 years ago in a diner kitchen at 3 in the morning. Hands wrinkled from 12 hours of dishwater, exhausted from washing pots and scrubbing floors, but unable to stop the music that poured out of him whenever he thought about the girl with blonde hair and blue eyes who smiled at everyone except the poor black scholarship kid who cleaned up after them. He'd given the melody to Dominic Vale, the confident white piano prodigy who was dating her, who'd discovered Elijah's secret one night and offered to deliver the song because he understood what it meant to love someone so much you'd give them pieces of yourself and never ask for credit or recognition or anything in return. Dominic had played it for Sophia under Wisconsin stars on a dock over a lake so still it reflected the Milky Way, and told her he'd written it just for her, poured everything he felt into those notes. 3 weeks later, Dominic died on a rain-slicked highway outside Madison. His car sliding off the road and down an embankment in a storm that came from nowhere. And the song became his legacy, his final gift to the girl he loved. The one beautiful thing that survived him. Except it had never been his song at all. Elijah's eyes closed as he played. His damaged right hand moved with a grace that shouldn't have been possible given the extent of the injury. Physical therapy had restored maybe 75% of function on good days. 80% when the weather cooperated and the pain medication was working and he'd warmed up properly. The fingers didn't spread as wide as they used to. The pinky had limited independent movement. The ring finger sometimes locked mid-motion, requiring him to compensate with his other fingers. But he'd learned to work around the limitations, to simplify passages that required more flexibility than the scarred tissue could provide. To let his left hand carry melodies his right hand couldn't quite manage anymore. To make the limitations part of the music itself, not weaknesses to hide, but honest admissions of where he'd been and what he'd survived and what still worked despite everything. The melody swelled, building from that gentle opening into something achingly beautiful. A cascade of sound that spoke of longing and loss and a love so deep it transcended words and time in the 16 years that had passed since he'd first written these notes. 43 seconds into the piece, his right hand cramped. Visibly, undeniably, the fingers seized mid-chord as damaged nerves misfired and muscles contracted involuntarily, pulling the fingers into a claw-like position that looked painful because it was. The music fractured. Several notes went missing. The rhythm stuttered like a heart skipping beats. 500 people gasped collectively, a sound like wind through tree. Maya didn't hesitate. Didn't gasp or panic or make it about her fear. She'd seen this before dozens of times in their apartment at 3 in the morning when her father thought she was sleeping. She'd watched through half-closed eyes as he practiced through pain that would make grown men weep, fighting through cramps and aches and the constant reminder that his hand would never work right again, all because he'd promised her late mother that music would stay in their lives. She reached over with her small hand, touched his shoulder. Didn't say anything because what was there to say? The touch communicated everything. I'm here. You're not alone. Keep going. I believe in you. The touch was enough. Elijah's eyes opened. He looked at his daughter sitting beside him, saw Naomi's eyes staring back at him. His wife, who'd died 3 years ago, who'd made him promise to keep fighting, keep creating, keep being the man she'd fallen in love with despite his broken hand and broken dreams. He adjusted his approach, simplified the passage his right hand had been attempting, let his left hand take over the melody while his right hand provided simpler accompaniment harmony instead of melody support, instead of leadership. The music transformed, different from what he'd originally written 16 years ago, but somehow more true, more human, more honest about the reality of broken things that still tried to make beauty. He finished the piece. The final notes hung in the air like smoke from incense, fading slowly. Silence. Absolute. Perfect. Profound. No one moved. No one breathed. The moment stretched like pulled taffy. Then Dr. Lawrence Ashford stood. 63 years old now, though he'd been in his late 40s when Elijah and Sophia had both known him at music camp. White hair gone mostly silver. Wire-rimmed glasses catching the stage lights. Tweed jacket with leather elbow patches, looking every inch the small-town music professor he'd been for 4 decades. He'd taught music at conservatories across the country for 40 years, had heard thousands of performances from students who had everything. Talent, money, connections, perfect technique drilled into them by the best teachers money could buy. He'd never heard anything like this. He began to clap, slow, deliberate. Each clap a statement of belief, a declaration that what he'd just witnessed mattered more than technical perfection, more than flawless execution, more than any competition prize or critical review. The woman sitting beside him, a donor he didn't know, someone wealthy enough to afford front-row seats, looked at him confused. Why he was applauding a performance that had so obviously included a mistake. Then she saw his face, saw the tears streaming down it, and understood that she'd missed something important. She stood, then the man behind her stood, then the entire 5th row, then the people in the 4th row, then the 3rd, then everyone on the orchestra level, then the balcony. 500 people rising to their feet like a wave rolling toward shore. Applause building from those scattered claps into something like thunder, before a summer storm rolling and building and growing until it filled every corner of the concert hall, bouncing off the acoustically perfect walls and ceiling and coming back amplified. Phones recorded everything, the standing ovation that went on for 3 full minutes. The old professor crying openly in the fifth row. The CEO in crimson standing in the wings with tears streaming down her face, the little girl in blue sitting beside her father at the piano touching his shoulder like she'd just performed a miracle. This would be viral by morning. The janitor who played like an angel with broken hands. The CEO who chose integrity over $200 million. The criminal dragged away in handcuffs. The daughter who saved her father's performance with a single touch. The imperfect performance that was somehow more perfect than perfection. The perfect story for an age that desperately wanted to believe that goodness still mattered, that love could survive. 16 years of silence, that broken things could still make beauty. Elijah finished, lifted his hands from the keys, looked at his daughter. Maya smiled, the kind of smile that says everything will be okay even when nothing else does, the kind of smile her mother used to give him when he was drowning in medical debt and career loss and the terror of raising a daughter alone. The standing ovation continued. People weren't sitting back down, weren't even thinking about sitting down. This was one of those moments that demanded you stand, demanded you bear witness, demanded you acknowledge that you'd seen something true. But stories don't start at the end. They start with questions that demand answering. The image froze. Elijah and Maya at the piano, Sophia crying stage right. 500 witnesses standing. Phones lifted like torches. Everything suspended in amber, that moment before understanding changes everything. White text appeared against the darkness, the questions that would drive the next 90 minutes. How did a janitor end up here? Why is the CEO crying? What crime did the man in handcuffs commit? What happened to those scarred hands who really wrote the song? The questions hung in the air like smoke, refusing to dissipate, like prayers waiting for answers, like the first notes of a melody that demands completion. Then the screen went black and new white text appeared 12 months earlier. December 24th, 2024. 7:00 p.m. Lancaster Tower, Chicago. The building rose 60 stories above Michigan Avenue, all glass and steel, and the kind of architectural ambition that spoke of old money making itself newer, more relevant, more powerful with each passing year. Lancaster Tower housed 347 businesses, employed over 4,000 people, and generated enough revenue to fund a small developing nation's annual budget. On the ground floor, the lobby had been transformed into something from a billionaire's fever dream of what Christmas should look like. Someone with a substantial budget and absolutely no sense of restraint. The event's coordinator Sophia had hired and then ignored had turned the marble and glass space into winter spectacle. The invoice she'd approved without reading said $47,000 for decorations alone, not counting the catering or the open bar or the chocolate fountain that was technically a sculpture and therefore qualified as art installation on the expense report. White lights cascaded down 40-foot marble pillars like frozen waterfalls, each strand perfectly spaced. According to some decorator's vision, each bulb precisely calibrated to create maximum sparkle without being garish. A Douglas fir stood near the executive elevators, 25 feet tall, requiring structural engineering calculations to ensure the floor could support its 3,200-pound weight when fully decorated. The ornaments hanging from its branches cost more individually than most people spent on their entire holiday shopping. Ice sculptures melted slowly under the ambient heat of 400 bodies, their abstract shapes suggesting reindeer or angels or perhaps just expensive water in temporary solid form. The scent of pine and cinnamon and expensive champagne filled every corner, mixing with perfume and cologne, and the particular smell of wealth gathered in concentration. A chocolate fountain burbled on the dessert table, Belgian chocolate naturally, because anything less would be beneath Lancaster Capital's standards, beneath Sophia Lancaster's carefully cultivated image of excellence in all things. 400 employees mingled in mandatory festivity. The memo had been clear: attendance tracked faces, noted absence required, doctor's notes, or documented family emergencies with proof. The company valued culture and team building, which translated to show up, smile, pretend you're having fun, drink, but not too much, network with the right people, and remember that your bonus depends partly on whether Sophia Lancaster personally recognizes you as someone who contributes to the company's success. Clusters form naturally along invisible lines of hierarchy and salary brackets. The executives gathered near the premium bar, drinking scotch that cost more per ounce than most bottles, talking about the Riverside acquisition and quarterly projections and which of them would make partner this year. The mid-level managers clustered near the dessert table, laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, calculating how many chocolate-covered strawberries they could eat without seeming greedy or unsophisticated. The junior staff huddled near the exits, watching the clock, waiting for the acceptable minimum attendance time to elapse, so they could escape to their actual families and actual Christmas celebrations that didn't feel like work. And then there was Elijah Cross. He moved through the crowd like water flowing around rocks, present but unnoticed, necessary but invisible, the kind of person whose labor made everything function but whom nobody thought about unless something broke. 36 years old, 6 feet tall, with an athletic build maintained through necessity rather than vanity. His job required lifting air conditioning units, climbing through access panels, crawling through spaces that hadn't been designed with human comfort in mind. Dark brown skin that caught the party lights in subtle variations of warmth. Short black hair kept neat because that's what the employee handbook required under Section 4.3, personal grooming standards for customer-facing staff. His gray work shirt had been washed so many times that the fabric was nearly transparent at the elbows, thin enough that you could see his undershirt through it if the light hit right. The Lancaster Capital logo over the breast pocket had faded from navy blue to something closer to gray, the letters barely legible after 3 years and hundreds of wash cycles. Grease stained the collar. He'd spent the afternoon fixing a heating vent on the 43rd floor, lying on his back in a crawl space barely wide enough for his shoulders, breathing air that smelled of dust and old metal, and the chemical tang of whatever commercial cleaning products the night crew used. His hands told their own story if anyone bothered to look, which most people didn't. Calluses on the palms from pipe wrenches and screwdrivers, and the specific wear patterns of someone who worked with tools daily. Grease under the nails that didn't quite come out no matter how hard he scrubbed with the industrial hand soap in the maintenance department's bathroom. Cuts and scrapes in various stages of healing, hazards of the job that he'd stopped noticing years ago. And on the right hand, scars, visible even in the dim party lighting, even from a distance if you knew what to look for. Surgical scars webbing across the palm like lightning frozen in flesh, creating patterns that spoke of serious trauma and serious intervention. The kind of scarring that made doctors wince and ask what happened, that made strangers stare and then look away quickly when they realized they were staring. Most people didn't notice Elijah Cross at all. They saw the janitor, the maintenance worker, the guy who fixed their toilets when they broke and changed the light bulbs in the conference rooms and made sure the heating worked in winter. They didn't see the artist, the concert pianist who'd once had a $300,000 contract. The man whose name had appeared in regional newspapers as rising talent to watch before everything fell apart in Cleveland on a stage with faulty rigging that someone in Theodore Lancaster's accounting department had approved, because proper equipment cost $17,000 more per quarter, and that was unacceptable to shareholders. Maya held his left hand with both of hers the way she did when she was excited and trying to contain it. 7 years old. Her skin was a shade lighter than her father's. She'd inherited some of her mother's complexion, that beautiful brown that looked like honey held up to sunlight. hair pulled back into careful braids decorated with colorful beads that Elijah had learned to install through YouTube tutorials and patience. And the determination of a man who'd promised his dying wife that their daughter would never lack for care. Never lack for the small touches that said someone loved her enough to spend an hour making sure her hair looked beautiful. She wore a simple dress, navy blue with small white flowers. Secondhand from the thrift store on Roosevelt Road, price tag said $4.99 before he'd carefully removed it with scissors so Maya wouldn't feel different from the other children in their expensive holiday dresses. Her best dress, the one she wore to church on Sundays and special occasions like this. Her shoes were scuffed but polished that morning with care, black Mary Janes that were half a size too small but would have to last another 6 months until he could afford to replace them. Her eyes were wide with wonder at everything around her, the lights, the tree, the people in their beautiful clothes, the chocolate fountain that seemed to flow forever like something from a fairy tale. "Daddy, look at the chocolate fountain." Her voice carried the hushed awe of someone seeing magic for the first time. Because for Maya, this probably was magic. Their apartment didn't have chocolate fountains, didn't have ice sculptures or 25-foot Christmas trees or champagne towers or any of the casual luxury that surrounded them now. Their apartment had a radiator that clanked when it worked and went silent when it didn't, leaving them huddled under blankets on the coldest nights. Had neighbors who fought at 2 in the morning, their voices carrying through walls thin enough to serve as amplification. Teaching Maya words she shouldn't know at 7 years old. Had a corner where Elijah had set up a small electronic keyboard. Not a real piano, couldn't afford that $79 from Amazon. With a crack in one of the keys that didn't affect the sound but bothered him every time he looked at it, where he taught her scales and simple melodies every evening after dinner. "Can I have some, Daddy, please?" Elijah looked at the chocolate fountain, looked at his daughter's hopeful face, did the mental calculation he did 100 times a day, the arithmetic of poverty that never stopped running in the back of his mind. Bus fare home was $4.50 total for both of them. Groceries for the week were budgeted at $87 and they were already at $73 with 3 days to go. The electric bill was overdue by 2 weeks and would incur a late fee if he didn't pay it by Monday. Maya needed refills on her asthma medication and insurance only covered 60%, which meant $18 out of pocket. The check engine light had come on in his car and he was hoping it was just a loose gas cap and not something that would cost hundreds to fix. A chocolate-covered strawberry wouldn't break the budget. But it represented a principle teaching Maya that not everything was available just because you wanted it, that sometimes you had to choose carefully, make decisions, live within limits that weren't fair, but were real. One piece, baby girl, piece, baby. Choose carefully. Make it count. She approached the dessert table with the gravity of a surgeon selecting instruments for a critical operation. Strawberries glistening with chocolate, apple slices, marshmallows, pretzels, all artfully arranged on tiered crystal platters that probably cost more than his monthly rent. She selected a strawberry with infinite care, her small fingers hovering over several options before committing. Held it under the cascading chocolate with her tongue caught between her teeth in concentration, making sure it was completely coated. Brought it to her mouth and ate it with her eyes closed, savoring every molecule of flavor, making it last, making it count. Elijah watched her with love that physically hurt a pain in his chest that never quite went away. Fierce and protective and tinged with the specific guilt that sat on him like a stone he couldn't cough up. Guilt that he couldn't give her what these other children had. Couldn't afford private schools where teachers knew every student's name. Couldn't provide music lessons with certified instructors instead of YouTube videos. And his own damaged teaching couldn't buy her Christmas presents that didn't come from clearance racks and careful budgeting and the layaway plan at Target. But she had music. He'd promised Naomi. On her deathbed, when the cancer had stolen everything but her voice in those final hours, she'd made him swear it. Keep music in our daughter's life. Don't let your pain poison her chances. Promise me, Elijah. Promise me. The memory was a knife that never dulled, that cut fresh every time he touched it. 3 years since his wife died. 3 years since the breast cancer stage 3. Aggressive, the kind that didn't care about experimental treatments or prayers or how desperately you loved someone. Diagnosis to death, 847 days. Medical bills, $127,000. Insurance covered $59,000. The rest went on credit cards at 23% interest that he'd never pay off, working maintenance at $42,000 annually. Not with rent and food and utilities and Maya's asthma medication and the 1,000 small costs of keeping a child alive and healthy and happy. He'd worked 3 jobs for 2 years while Naomi went through chemo and radiation and clinical trials that insurance companies called experimental and therefore not covered. Warehouse work during the day, stocking shelves and loading trucks for $12 an hour. Night security at a hospital, sitting alone in a parking booth for 10 hours straight for $13.50 an hour. Weekend maintenance at an apartment complex for $15 an hour. Unclogging toilets and fixing garbage disposals and pretending the residents weren't treating him like servant when they demanded he come immediately to deal with problems they could have handled themselves. Maya had barely seen him for 2 years. Dropped off at daycare at 6:30 in the morning, picked up at 7 at night by a father who was too exhausted to do anything but heat up frozen dinners and fall asleep on the couch while she watched cartoons. But Naomi said it was worth it, said survival was worth any sacrifice. Said they'd have time together after she beat this, after the treatments worked, after everything went back to normal. Except it didn't work. The cancer was too aggressive, too advanced. By the time they'd caught it, too resistant to the treatments that cost everything they had and everything they could borrow. She died in their apartment, in their bed, with Maya asleep in the chair beside the bed because their girl had refused to leave her mother's side for the last 3 days, had insisted on staying close enough to hear her breathe. And the last thing Naomi said, her voice barely a whisper, her hand squeezing his with a strength that didn't match her wasted body, was, "Promise me." The music, "Promise me." And he'd promised. Because what else could he do? How could he deny his dying wife anything she asked, especially something that mattered that much? So Maya had music, even though teaching her meant touching the wound of his own destroyed career. Meant remembering what he'd lost, meant confronting every day the fact that his daughter would never have the opportunities he'd had because he couldn't afford to give them to her. But she had music. He was keeping the promise. That had to count for something. Across the lobby on the mezzanine level that overlooked the party, like a throne overlooking subjects, Sophia Lancaster surveyed her domain with the careful attention of someone who'd learned that power required constant vigilance. At 34, she commanded rooms through presence alone, not through loudness. She rarely raised her voice, had learned from her father that quiet certainty was more powerful than shouting. Not through aggression. She didn't need to be aggressive when measured competence and strategic intelligence worked better. Just presence. The kind that made people sit up straighter when she entered a room, made conversations pause mid-sentence, made grown men with multiple graduate degrees and decades of experience suddenly worry they'd forgotten something important. She was beautiful in the way expensive things are beautiful. Carefully maintained, strategically enhanced, designed to project success and capability and the kind of perfection that came from having resources to invest in appearance. Honey blonde hair that fell past her shoulders in soft waves that looked effortless but required a stylist at $340 monthly plus the right products plus regular treatments to maintain the color and texture. Ice blue eyes that people described as piercing or calculating. Eyes that seemed to measure everything they looked at: angles, weaknesses, opportunities, threats. Bone structure that photographed well and looked even better in person. The kind of genetic lottery win that opened doors before competence got a chance to matter. Her skin held a subtle tan even in December's depths because she had access to a private roof deck with climate-controlled comfort and UV-optimized lounge chairs and the time to use them because she'd structured her schedule to include 30 minutes of wellness time daily. That was actually just lying in the sun thinking about quarterly projections. The crimson dress she wore tonight was bold without apology. A V-neck that drew attention precisely where she wanted it drawn. Fitted through the waist to emphasize the work she put into maintaining her figure through a personal trainer who came to her building 3 times weekly at 6 in the morning. Heels that added 3 inches to her 5'7" frame, making her tall enough to look most men in the eye, tall enough to project authority without seeming to try. Diamonds at her throat and wrists caught the party lights and threw them back in sharp flashes. Not her mother's jewelry, because her mother had died when Sophia was 12, and her father had sold everything within 6 months rather than let sentiment interfere with asset optimization and capital reallocation. She held a glass of champagne she hadn't touched. Standing at the mezzanine railing, one hand on the brass rail, the other holding the glass. More as prop than beverage, watching her employees perform their assigned roles in the social theater she'd constructed. Rachel Porter appeared at her elbow with the swint efficiency of someone who'd learned to anticipate needs before they were voiced. 28 years old. White with dark brown hair pulled back in a professional bun that suggested competence without competing with her boss. Dressed in a charcoal gray pantsuit that said, "I'm good at my job," without trying to say, "Look at me." She carried a tablet like a shield, her defense against the world. Her source of power through information and organization and the ability to produce any fact or figure or document Sophia might need on 3 seconds' notice. "The numbers look good for Q4, boss." Rachel's voice was carefully modulated, professional, precise pitch to be heard over the party noise without shouting. "The Riverside acquisition closed this morning at $47.2 million, came in $2.8 million under budget. Board's very pleased. Thompson called it exceptionally well executed in his email this afternoon." Sophia barely glanced at the tablet screen Rachel offered. "They should be pleased. 47.2 for a property worth $65 million in current market conditions is highway robbery. We could flip it tomorrow for a $20 million profit if we wanted to be crass about it. Should I send acknowledgement to the team? Standard bonus structure, nothing extraordinary. They performed at expectation level, nothing above." Sophia took the smallest possible sip of champagne, more touching the glass to her lips than actually drinking. "What else?" Rachel hesitated for a microsecond, the kind of pause Sophia had learned to read after 3 years of working together. The pause that meant her assistant was about to venture into territory that might provoke a negative reaction, but was important enough to risk it. "Boss, you've been working 18-hour days for 3 months straight. The team's noticed. HR mentioned concerns about burnout and modeling unhealthy work-life balance. And Garrett's been asking about you." The temperature around them seemed to drop 5 degrees. Sophia's expression didn't change dramatically. She'd learned long ago not to show emotional reactions that could be used against her, but her eyes went from coolly professional to Arctic in an instant, and the hand on the brass rail tightened until her knuckles showed white against her skin. "I don't pay you to manage my personal life, Rachel." Her voice was quiet, controlled, the kind of quiet that was more threatening than shouting. I pay you to manage my schedule, coordinate my meetings, and ensure I have the information I need when I need it. Are we clear on that distinction? Rachel took a step back, a minimal retreat that acknowledged the boundary. Crystal clear, boss. My apologies for overstepping. Don't apologize, just don't do it again. The younger woman retreated toward the stairs with practiced grace that suggested this wasn't the first boundary test and probably wouldn't be the last, but that she knew when to push and when to back down. Which was why Sophia kept her employed, despite periodic intrusions into personal territory. Alone again at the railing, Sophia returned her attention to the crowd below. 400 employees performing their assigned roles in the social machinery she'd constructed and maintained and ruthlessly optimized. The executives networking because that's what executives did, building alliances and testing political waters and positioning themselves for the next round of promotions. The mid-level managers laughing at jokes that weren't particularly funny, because the person telling them controlled performance reviews and advancement opportunities. The junior staff counting minutes until they could escape without it being noted on their permanent records. And somewhere in that crowd, invisible to most people, a janitor and his daughter experiencing a world they'd never truly belonged to. No matter how many chocolate-covered strawberries they ate or Christmas parties they attended. Sophia didn't notice them. Not yet. She was looking at the bigger picture, the quarterly returns that would determine her bonus, the acquisition pipeline that would determine the company's growth trajectory. The board meeting next week where she'd have to defend her decision to invest $73 million in renewable energy projects despite her father's vocal opposition and the board's general skepticism about anything that didn't produce immediate returns. Theodore Lancaster had built this company through ruthlessness and corner-cutting and a willingness to sacrifice anyone and anything that got in the way of shareholder value and quarterly growth. Sophia had inherited his empire and his methods, though she told herself she was more ethical, more conscious of consequences, more willing to balance profit against principle. But late at night, when she couldn't sleep despite the Ambien and the meditation apps and the white noise machine, she wondered if she was just better at rationalizing the same fundamental cruelty, better at dressing exploitation in progressive language, better at convincing herself that quarterly returns and human well-being could somehow coexist, when all evidence suggested they were fundamentally opposed. Beneath the armor of designer wardrobe and boardroom reputation and ice blue eyes that made men nervous, Sophia Lancaster carried a wound that had never properly healed, that had scabbed over but never truly closed, that still bled when touched wrong. 16 years ago, when she was 18 years old and still believed that love was real and good and worth pursuing, she'd fallen in love with a boy who played piano like he was trying to make the instrument confess secrets. Dominic Vale, piano prodigy from a middle-class family in Milwaukee. All wild dark hair that refused to be tamed and passionate eyes that seemed to burn with intensity when he played, and the kind of raw talent that made you forget to breathe when you watched his fingers move across the keys. They'd met at summer music camp in Wisconsin, one of those expensive 8-week programs for talented teenagers whose parents could afford to invest in their artistic futures. Sophia had been there because her father thought classical music training would look good on Ivy League college applications and would teach discipline and excellence and the kind of dedication to perfection that would serve her well in business. Dominic had been there on partial scholarship, his tuition paid partly by his parents' second mortgage and partly by a foundation that recognized genius regardless of bank balance. He'd written her a song, or so she'd thought. Called it Midnight Sonata, played it for her one night under stars so bright they seemed close enough to touch on a dock over a lake so still it reflected the Milky Way in perfect detail. Whispered that the song held everything he felt, but couldn't say in words, everything he wanted to give her but didn't have language for everything their future could be, if she'd just trust him and trust the music and trust that love was enough. She'd cried that night. Happy tears, the kind that came from being seen and loved and chosen by someone who seemed to understand her better than she understood herself. They'd kissed under those impossible stars, and Sophia had really believed with her whole 18-year-old heart that this was the beginning of forever, that she'd found the one person who would never leave her the way her mother had left her 6 years earlier. When an aneurysm exploded in her brain between the roses and the tulips in the garden. 3 weeks later, police officers stood on her parents' doorstep in the expensive suburb north of Chicago. Hats in hand, faces carefully neutral in the way that police faces got when they were about to destroy someone's world. Miss Lancaster, there's been an accident. Dominic Vale was killed when his vehicle left Route 12 during heavy rain and struck a tree. He was pronounced dead at the scene. We're so very sorry for your loss. The song had died with him, or so Sophia believed for the next 16 years. She'd never heard it played again, never sought out recordings because there were none. Dominic had never written it down, never performed it publicly. It existed only in her memory and in the recording she'd made on her phone that night on the dock, battery dying, audio quality terrible, but enough to remember, enough to hold on to when everything else felt like it was slipping away. She'd forbidden herself from listening to music the way she once had, with her whole heart, with vulnerability, with the willingness to let it transport her somewhere beyond spreadsheets and quarterly returns and the careful performance of competence. Music became background noise, elevator music, something to ignore rather than embrace, because if she let herself feel it too deeply, the grief that had been waiting for 16 years would swallow her whole and she'd never climb out. So she built walls instead, measured worth in dollars and market share and titles and all the things that couldn't die in car accidents, or abandon you for aneurysms, or ask you to feel anything beyond professional excellence. And she accepted Garrett Blackwell's proposal 6 months ago, because marriage to another CEO made strategic sense. Their combined companies would create market dominance in commercial real estate development. And love was for people who couldn't afford better options or hadn't learned yet that emotions were just chemical reactions that could be managed through proper discipline and focus. Maya's bright voice cut through Sophia's thoughts like a bell ringing across water. The child had wandered away from her father, not far, just to the dessert table drawn by the chocolate fountain, like every other child at the party. Like a moth to flame or a ship to lighthouse or any other metaphor for irresistible attraction. She was reaching for a chocolate-covered strawberry on the top tier of the crystal platter. Stretching on her tiptoes, her small body extending upward with the complete commitment of someone who hasn't learned yet to be afraid of falling. Her fingers brushed the edge of the strawberry, almost had it just needed another half-inch of reach. Just beyond her grasp, she stretched farther, rose higher on her toes, committed fully to the attempt. Her weight shifted forward as her balance tipped past the point of recovery. And her right foot slipped. The floor was marble, beautiful Carrara marble imported from Italy at $97 per square foot, polished to a mirror shine that reflected the Christmas lights like stars captured in stone. Beautiful, expensive, slippery when wet. Someone had spilled champagne. Not much, just a small puddle near the dessert table. No one had bothered to tell anyone. Why would you interrupt your networking to worry about something a janitor would eventually clean up? These things handled themselves if you just waited long enough. Maya's foot went out from under her like she'd stepped on ice. She fell hard, all her 7-year-old weight coming down on her right knee, as it cracked against the marble with a sound that was small but sharp enough to carry in a momentary lull in conversation. The sound was like a branch snapping, like ice breaking, like something delicate meeting something impossibly hard. Her face crumpled instantly, that shift from concentration to pain to fear that happens so fast in children, their emotions right at the surface where any stimulus can pull them up and out. Blood began seeping through her white tights, immediately spreading in a dark stain that looked almost black under the party lighting, a stain that would never fully come out, no matter how many times Elijah washed them. Elijah was across the room in seconds. He moved faster than most people would have thought possible for a man his size, with the kind of speed that comes from parental instinct overriding everything else: exhaustion, social anxiety, the awareness that executives were staring at him, the knowledge that drawing attention to himself was usually a mistake. None of that mattered. His daughter was hurt. Everything else became background noise. He dropped to his knees beside her without caring that he was getting blood on his work pants, without caring that he was creating a scene, without caring about anything except the fact that Maya was hurt and crying and he needed to fix it, because fixing things was literally his job and metaphorically his entire identity as a father. He pulled a clean handkerchief from his pocket, always carried one, a habit from childhood when his mother had insisted that a gentleman always carried a clean handkerchief, even if that gentleman was a poor black kid from the South Side who'd never be mistaken for actual gentleman in any context that mattered. Pressed it gently to her scraped knee, applying just enough pressure to slow the bleeding without hurting her more. His voice dropped to that low, soothing register he used when she woke from nightmares about mommy not being there anymore, when she had asthma attacks in the middle of the night, when the world felt too big and scary and she needed to hear her daddy's voice saying everything would be okay. "Hey, sweetheart, daddy's got you. You're okay, just a little scrape. We'll fix it. You're so brave, baby girl, so brave. We'll get you cleaned up and it'll be like new. I've got you. Daddy's got you." Maya's sobs quieted to hiccups as he held her, as his broad hand cradled the back of her head and drew her close to his chest so she could hear his heartbeat steady and strong. The same heartbeat she'd heard as a baby when he rocked her to sleep at 3 in the morning. Because Naomi was too sick from chemotherapy to get out of bed, too weak to do anything but whisper instructions about how many ounces and which burp cloth and whether the diaper needed changing. The world could end around them in fire and flood, and Elijah wouldn't notice, wouldn't care, wouldn't shift his attention for even a microsecond. There was only his daughter and her pain and his absolute responsibility to ease it, to make it better, to be the safe place she could always come to no matter what. Then a man's voice sliced through the moment like a knife through silk, sharp and contemptuous, and carrying the kind of casual cruelty that came from a lifetime of never being challenged. "Can you control your child?" Garrett Blackwell strode over each step, deliberate and sharp, expensive Italian leather shoes clicking on the marble with a sound like judgment being pronounced. 35 years old, white with perfectly styled chestnut brown hair that cost $200 a month to maintain at a salon in the Gold Coast that didn't serve people like Elijah Cross. That probably had never served people like Elijah Cross in its entire 15-year history. Clean-shaven jaw that suggested good genetics and expensive skincare products, and the kind of professional grooming that required both money and time. Tailored Navy suit that probably cost $3,400 if you knew where to look for the signs of bespoke tailoring. Italian silk tie, Swiss watch on his wrist that cost $47,000 more than Elijah earned in an entire year working maintenance. He was Sophia's fiancé, or rather, he was the man her father had chosen for her to marry, the merger disguised as matrimony, the strategic alliance wrapped in white tulle and wedding vows that meant nothing to either party except on balance sheets and in board presentations. 6 weeks from now, February 7th, 2025, they'd stand before 300 guests at the Four Seasons Ballroom and exchange vows about love and honor and cherishing, and everyone in attendance would know it was performance theater. The social machinery of wealth maintaining itself through strategic coupling. Love had nothing to do with it. Love was for people who couldn't afford better strategies or hadn't learned yet that emotions were just obstacles to optimal decision-making. Garrett gestured at the small smear of blood on the marble floor, at the child crying in her father's arms, at the scene that was drawing attention away from the networking and deal-making and social climbing that was the actual point of this party. His lip curled slightly, a microscopically small expression of distaste, as if the sight offended his aesthetic sensibilities or disrupted some carefully curated vision of how Christmas Eve should look. "This is a corporate event, not a daycare center." His voice carried deliberately, making sure people nearby could hear, making sure the hierarchy was clear, making sure everyone understood their place in the social order. "If you can't afford a babysitter, maybe you shouldn't have brought her. There are appropriate venues for children, and this isn't one of them." Elijah's jaw tightened, muscles bunching beneath his dark skin. The handkerchief in his hand pressed to Maya's knee absorbed her blood while his other hand tightened into a fist, then deliberately relaxed because he'd learned a long time ago that showing anger, that expressing the rage that lived in him like a second heartbeat, only made things worse, only gave people excuses to dismiss him or fear him or call security. But his voice stayed level when he spoke. Calm, controlled. The kind of calm that came from years of practice swallowing fire, years of keeping his face neutral, while supervisors berated him for problems that weren't his fault. Years of accepting disrespect with grace because fighting back meant losing his job. And losing his job meant Maya didn't eat, and didn't have health insurance, and didn't have the stability she desperately needed. "She's 7 years old. She slipped on something wet that someone spilled and didn't bother reporting. It was an accident. Children have accidents. It's normal. An accident that wouldn't have happened if you knew your place." Garrett's eyes raked over Elijah's work clothes with undisguised contempt. The kind of contempt that didn't need to be spoken but came through anyway, in the curl of the lip, the narrowing of the eyes, the slight lean backward, as if proximity to someone in a janitor's uniform might be contagious or degrading. "Your maintenance staff. There's a staff entrance on the loading dock for a reason. This party is for employees who actually contribute to company value, who generate revenue, who matter in the operational sense. Not for..." He paused as if searching for polite phrasing for something inherently rude. "Support personnel." Maya's bottom lip trembled as she looked up at her father, and even at 7 years old she was starting to understand that something was wrong here. That the nice man in the expensive suit was being mean to her daddy, in a way she didn't fully comprehend, but could feel in the tension of her father's arms and the silence of the people around them and the way everyone was pretending not to watch while absolutely watching. Something in Elijah's chest cracked, not broke, because broken men couldn't take care of daughters who needed them, but cracked a fissure in the careful control he maintained 24 hours a day, 365 days a year. He opened his mouth to respond, to say something, to defend himself or his daughter, or just to push back in some small way against this casual cruelty, this public humiliation, this reminder that the world was divided into people who mattered and people who didn't, and he and Maya were firmly in the latter category. But before he could speak, another voice cut through the moment like a sword through silk. "You don't have the authority to speak to my employees that way." Sophia Lancaster descended the mezzanine stairs with deliberate grace, each step measured and purposeful, and carrying the weight of someone who'd been trained since childhood to command attention through posture and presence. Every movement was economical, intentional, nothing wasted or casual or unconsidered. When she reached them, when she stood 3 feet from Garrett and 5 feet from Elijah and 6 feet from the small pool of Maya's blood on the marble floor, her ice-blue eyes fixed on Garrett with a coldness that could frost windows, that made the air temperature feel like it dropped 10 degrees, that made grown men with law degrees and corner offices suddenly remember urgent phone calls they needed to make. Her voice was quiet when she spoke, controlled, but it carried across the lobby, and the sudden silence carried to all 400 witnesses who'd stopped pretending not to watch and were now openly staring at the drama unfolding by the dessert table. Apologize to them. Now. The room had gone completely silent. 400 people holding their collective breath. Phones starting to emerge from pockets and purses, because if a Lancaster Capital executive was about to be publicly humiliated by the CEO, people wanted documentation, wanted to be able to say they were there, wanted the social currency of having witnessed the moment. Garrett's face flushed red color rising from his collar like mercury in a thermometer. His carefully maintained composure cracking under the public challenge to his authority and status. His jaw clenched. For a long moment it looked like he might refuse, might escalate, might turn this into a confrontation about hierarchy and who had the right to give orders to whom, and whether Sophia's authority as CEO trumped his authority as her fiancé and future co-chairman of the merged companies. But Sophia's expression didn't change, didn't waver, didn't give him any room to maneuver or negotiate, just waited with the infinite patience of someone who had all the power in this equation and knew it, and was willing to stand there until the heat death of the universe, if that's what it took. Sorry. The word came out clipped, mechanical, directed more at the floor than at Elijah or Maya. The kind of apology that wasn't really an apology but a strategic retreat, a tactical withdrawal, a recognition that this particular battle wasn't worth the cost. My apologies for the misunderstanding. Sophia turned to Elijah then, and for just a moment, a fraction of a second that probably nobody else noticed, but that burned itself into Elijah's memory with perfect clarity, her expression softened. The Ice Queen mask slipped just enough to show something human underneath something that looked like empathy or recognition or connection. She looked at the way he held his daughter, the care in his scarred hands, the protective fury barely restrained in the set of his shoulders, the blood on his pants that he didn't seem to notice because his daughter's pain mattered infinitely more than his dignity. She saw something that felt dangerously close to recognition, though she couldn't name. Why couldn't identify the source of the feeling? Just a sense of familiarity, like déjà vu. Like looking at a photograph of someone you'd known in another life. In my building, we don't measure people's worth by their job title. Her voice carried across the lobby, making sure all 400 witnesses heard, making sure they understood this wasn't negotiable, wasn't up for discussion, wasn't subject to debate. We measure them by their character, by how they treat people who can't do anything for them, by whether they help when someone falls instead of criticizing them for being on the ground. She looked back at Garrett, her expression hardening again. And right now, Mr. Blackwell, your character is seriously lacking. Then she turned back to Elijah, and her voice softened again, became almost gentle. Take care of your daughter. There's a first aid kit in the executive lounge on the 5th floor. Take the private elevator, the brass doors behind my desk. Take your time. Make sure she's okay. Elijah nodded, his throat too tight for words, his mind still trying to process what had just happened, that the CEO of Lancaster Capital had just publicly defended him against her own fiancé, had just elevated him above one of the most powerful men in Chicago's business community, had just looked at him like he was a person who mattered instead of invisible maintenance staff. He scooped Maya into his arms with practiced ease, cradling her carefully so her injured knee didn't touch anything. As he passed Sophia on his way to the private elevator, their eyes met for a second time that evening. Something passed between them in that moment, not quite understanding, not quite recognition. Just something, a question neither of them knew how to ask, a connection neither could explain, a sense that this moment mattered in ways that wouldn't become clear until much later. Then he was gone, the brass elevator doors closing behind him, and his daughter and Sophia was left standing in the lobby with 400 witnesses and a fiancé whose face had gone from red to white to a mottled combination that suggested he was having difficulty controlling his temper. Garrett stood there for a long moment, jaw working silently, hands clenched into fists at his sides. Then he turned on his heel and stalked toward the premium bar, his expensive shoes clicking sharply on the marble, people parting to let him through like water flowing around a rock. Conversations resumed gradually, the party machinery grinding back into motion, people turning back to their networking and their drinks and their careful performances of success. Sophia climbed back up to the mezzanine level, returned to her post overlooking the party, picked up her champagne glass that Rachel had thoughtfully refilled. But something about the scene continued to unsettle her. Not the confrontation with Garrett that was routine, predictable, exactly the kind of power play she'd been managing since taking over as CEO 3 years ago. No, what unsettled her was the way Elijah had held his daughter. Gentle but unbreakable. The kind of love that would burn down the world to keep a child safe. The kind of love that didn't calculate cost-benefit ratios or measure return on investment, or consider strategic implications. Just pure, fierce, uncomplicated devotion. It reminded her of some feeling from a lifetime ago when love had seemed simple and true and worth pursuing. She shook her head, took a sip of champagne she didn't taste, pushed the feeling away. There was work to do. Always more work to do. Quarterly projections to review. Acquisition targets to evaluate. A board meeting next week where she'd have to defend decisions her father would have never made. The feeling would pass. Feelings always did if you ignored them long enough. An hour and 7 minutes later, Elijah and Maya returned to the party. Maya's knee was properly bandaged now, white medical gauze visible under fresh white tights that Rachel Porter had somehow produced from her seemingly bottomless bag of solutions to problems. Her spirits had been restored by hot chocolate made with real cream and Belgian chocolate shavings, and by cookies that came from a bakery that probably charged more per cookie than Elijah's hourly wage, and by the kind attention of Rachel, who'd sat with her in the executive lounge and talked to her like she was a person instead of an inconvenient child. She tugged Elijah toward the piano, her small hand wrapped around 2 of his fingers, pulling with the insistence of someone who'd decided what she wanted and wasn't going to be dissuaded. "Daddy, can you play, please, just one song so I can sleep? You always say music helps me sleep." The piano sat in the corner of the lobby, a vintage Steinway grand that usually sat covered and silent, more decorative than functional part of the building's aesthetic vocabulary, old money classical elegance. The kind of detail that suggested cultivation without requiring actual use. But tonight someone had removed the dust cover, propped open the lid, created an impromptu performance space that had attracted a small crowd of tipsy employees. A man from the accounting department, mid-40s, balding tie, loosened after 3 glasses of wine, sat at the bench, playing 3 chords in sequence with more enthusiasm than skill. People had gathered around him laughing, making requests for songs he couldn't play. Applauding his attempts anyway because alcohol made everything more entertaining. Elijah hesitated, his body physically pulling back even as Maya pulled forward. He hadn't played publicly in years, not since the accident. God, the accident. The memory rose up like bile burning on the way up, impossible to swallow back down. Flashback. Cleveland. November 14th, 2012, 7:47 p.m. The theater smelled of new paint and old wood and possibility. Elijah had arrived early for rehearsal, carrying his sheet music in a leather folder his mother had saved for 3 months to buy him, wearing the new suit he'd bought specifically for this tour, the first suit he'd ever owned that wasn't secondhand. The first time his name would appear on professional posters, the first time he'd be paid to do the thing he loved most. 23 years old. Fresh contract with Lancaster Productions, a subsidiary of Theodore Lancaster's entertainment division. Though Elijah hadn't made the connection to Sophia yet, hadn't known that the company paying him $300,000 for a 20-city regional concert series was owned by the father of the girl he'd loved from afar 5 years earlier. His first professional performance. The beginning of everything he'd dreamed about since he was 8 years old, and his mother had taken him to a free concert in the park, and he'd watched a man make a piano sing and decided that's what he wanted to do with his life. The stage crew had been setting up lighting rigging above the stage. Heavy equipment, trusses, theatrical lights, cables, counterweights. Half a ton of metal and glass and electrical components suspended 40 feet above the stage floor by bolts and cables and truss. Truss that was misplaced. The metal groaned. A sound like the earth sighing, like steel under stress, like something fundamental giving way. Nobody heard it over the orchestra tuning in the pit. Nobody except Elijah, who'd spent enough time in theaters to know that sound meant something was wrong, meant metal was failing, meant someone was about to get hurt. He looked up, saw the truss shifting bolts that had been stressed past their safety margins, pulling free from the mounting brackets. Saw metal fatigue in the welds, saw cracks spreading through structural members. Saw death swinging down from the ceiling. The bolts had been stressed past safety limits because someone in Theodore Lancaster's accounting department had decided that proper equipment with appropriate safety margins cost $17,000 more per quarter than substandard equipment that met minimum code requirements. And $17,000 times 4 quarters times 6 regional theaters was $408,000 that could be redirected to executive bonuses and shareholder dividends. The young cellist sat directly beneath. 19 years old, white girl from Juilliard, accepted on full scholarship, first professional gig, red hair pulled back in a careful bun, wearing a black dress that her roommate had lent her because she couldn't afford concert attire yet. Tuning her instrument with headphones and completely absorbed in the music, completely oblivious to the death swinging down toward her head. The truss let go. Half a ton of equipment. Lights, cables, steel, crossbeams, electrical components. Falling like God's judgment, like physics making its final argument, like the universe correcting an imbalance. Elijah didn't think. Thinking takes time, and he had maybe 2 seconds between seeing the bolts fail and impact with the stage floor. He moved on instinct and the kind of reflexes that came from growing up in a neighborhood where awareness meant survival and hesitation meant consequences. He shoved the cellist. Hard. Sent her sprawling into the orchestra pit, safe. Tried to pull back to get clear himself, to retreat from the falling equipment. Wasn't fast enough. The truss caught his right hand, crushed it against the stage floor with 1,247 pounds of force concentrated on the small bones of his hand. The sound was like stepping on a bag full of eggshells wrapped in wet cloth, a wet, crunching snap that his brain couldn't quite process as the sound of his own bones being pulverized. Pain came later. First there was just pressure, immense, impossible pressure, like his hand was being pressed in a vice that kept tightening beyond any reasonable limit. Then the wet heat of blood spreading under his palm, soaking through his new suit jacket that he'd never be able to wear again. Then screaming his own screaming, he realized after several seconds a sound he'd never made before and hoped never to make again. The paramedics arrived, gave him morphine that turned the world soft at the edges, made the pain recede to something observable rather than all-consuming. Cut away his new suit jacket with trauma shears to access the damage. One of the paramedics, a woman with kind eyes and 20 years of experience, looked at his hand, then looked away quickly, her professional composure cracking for just a moment. That's when Elijah knew. Not broken, destroyed. 3 surgeries over 6 months. First surgery, stabilization, cleaning out bone fragments, setting what could be set. Second surgery, nerve grafts, taking healthy nerve tissue from his forearm and splicing it where nerves had been severed. Third surgery, revision, adjusting the healing that hadn't gone quite right, trying to improve the function that wasn't returning as expected. Total operating time across all 3 surgeries, 127 hours. Titanium pins holding bones together that had been reduced to fragments. Skin grafts covering areas where tissue damage was too extensive for natural healing. Physical therapy 5 hours daily for 8 months, learning to make his hand work again. Learning to accept that work again meant 70% function on good days and 50% on bad days. The doctor's verdict delivered with clinical detachment designed to soften the blow, but which somehow made it worse. You'll never play professionally again. The nerve damage is too extensive. The fine motor control required for concert-level performance, it's just not possible anymore. I'm sorry, Mr. Cross. I'm truly sorry. Lancaster Productions settled for $75,000. After legal fees and medical bills that insurance hadn't covered, Elijah walked away with $4,000 and a right hand that would never play piano the way it used to, that would always hurt when it rained, that would always remind him of what he'd lost every time he looked at it. The contract was terminated, the tour canceled. His name disappeared from posters that had already been printed, replaced with "To be announced." Dr. Lawrence Ashford called again, but this time the conversation wasn't about schedules and repertoire. It was about career alternatives and accepting reality and how sometimes talent wasn't enough. And maybe he should consider teaching or arts administration or something that didn't require the kind of technical precision his hand could no longer provide. That was 13 years ago. Elijah stood by the piano, his daughter tugging his hand. Memories of Cleveland wrapping around him like chains. But Maya was asking. Her eyes were hopeful. It was Christmas Eve. She'd been brave about her scraped knee. And he'd promised Naomi, keep music in her life, don't let your pain poison her chances, and that promise meant more than his fear, meant more than his shame, meant more than the terror of playing in public and having people see how limited he'd become. How could he say no to his daughter on Christmas Eve when she just wanted to hear her daddy play? He couldn't. He sat down at the piano. The tipsy accountant vacated the bench with exaggerated courtesy, bowing and gesturing like he was presenting a throne. The crowd that had gathered around the amateur performance didn't disperse. Instead, more people drifted over, curious about the janitor who was apparently going to play, wondering if this was going to be entertaining or embarrassing, pulling out phones just in case it was worth recording. Elijah's fingers hovered over the keys for a long moment, trembling slightly, not from fear, though there was plenty of that, but from nerve damage that never quite went away, that made his hand shake when he was tired or stressed or cold, or any of a dozen other triggers he couldn't always predict or control. The scars across his right palm caught the party lights, creating shadows in the valleys where tissue had healed badly, where surgical steel had tried and failed to completely restore what had been pulverized. Spiderweb patterns of surgical scars, railroad tracks of nerve grafts, the specific topography of serious trauma and serious intervention. Then he began to play. The melody that filled the lobby was unlike anything most of the people there had ever heard. Not because it was technically complex or showed off virtuosic skill, but because it was honest in a way that professional performances rarely were. Because it came from somewhere deeper than training or practice or the desire to impress. Gentle at first, like rain beginning to fall, individual drops distinct before the deluge. Each note placed with the kind of precision that suggested this wasn't performance, but prayer, wasn't entertainment, but testimony. The melody built slowly, patiently, like someone who'd learned through hard experience that rushing only breaks things, that beauty requires time and care and attention to detail that can't be forced or hurried. It swelled into something achingly beautiful, a cascade of sound that spoke of longing and loss and a love so deep it transcended words, not showy. Elijah's damaged hand couldn't manage showy anymore, couldn't execute the kind of flashy runs and dramatic flourishes that concert pianists use to prove their technical superiority. But it didn't need to be showy. The emotional honesty was enough, was more than enough, was everything. His eyes closed as he played, shutting out the crowd and the lights and the awareness of being watched. His body swayed slightly with the rhythm, moving with the music like they were two parts of the same organism. His damaged right hand moved with a grace that defied its injury, compensating, adjusting, finding new paths around old limitations, making beauty despite the disability, making beauty because of it. He played from memory, from the marrow of his bones, from a place deeper than technique or training. Every note was a piece of his heart laid bare on the marble floor, offered up to strangers who had no idea what they were witnessing. The song was Midnight Sonata, written 16 years ago in the summer of 2008 in a diner kitchen at 3 a.m. His hands wrinkled from 12 hours of dishwater, exhausted from washing pots and scrubbing floors, but unable to sleep because the music kept running through his head. And he knew if he didn't write it down, it would be lost forever. Written for a girl with honey blonde hair and ice blue eyes who laughed at everyone's jokes except his, because he'd never worked up the courage to speak to her who dated Dominic Vale, because Dominic was confident and talented and white, and belonged in her world in ways Elijah never could. He'd given the melody to Dominic, handed it over on a scrap of paper with the notes penciled in, and the dynamics marked, in a note that said, "For Sophia, because I can't tell her myself and you can." Dominic had looked at the music, looked at Elijah, understood everything in that moment without anything needing to be said. "Let me give it to her," Dominic had offered. "She deserves to hear this, and you deserve to give her something beautiful even if she never knows it came from you." So Elijah had said yes. Because that's what you do when you love someone from the shadows, when you love someone who doesn't know you exist, when you love someone who will never see you as anything but the poor kid who washes their dishes. You give them pieces of yourself and you never ask for credit or recognition or anything in return, except the knowledge that somewhere in the world someone you love has something beautiful that you created. Dominic had played Midnight Sonata for Sophia under Wisconsin stars on a dock over a lake so still it reflected the universe, and told her he'd written it just for her, poured everything he felt into those notes. 3 weeks later, Dominic died on a rain-slicked highway outside Madison, and the song became his legacy, his final gift, the one beautiful thing that survived him. Except it had never been Dominic's song at all. It had been Elijah's song, given away, attributed to someone else, a secret that Elijah had carried for 16 years without telling anyone, because what would be the point? Dominic was dead. Sophia believed the song was his. Correcting the record would only hurt her, would only take away something she treasured, would serve no purpose except Elijah's ego, and he'd learned a long time ago to put ego aside in service of other people's happiness. But now he was playing it, in Sophia's building, at Sophia's party, with Sophia somewhere in the crowd. Though he couldn't see her with his eyes closed, couldn't know whether she was listening or whether she'd left or whether she'd recognized the melody that had defined her grief for 16 years. Sophia Lancaster had been preparing to leave. She'd said her goodbyes to the board members and major donors who'd attended, had accepted compliments on the party with the appropriate amount of graciousness, had endured 30 seconds of small talk with Garrett about wedding planning that made her want to scream. but which she'd navigated with professional competence, had been planning her escape to her penthouse 3 blocks away where she could finally take off the CEO mask and be alone with spreadsheets and silence. The music reached her like a physical touch, like someone putting their hand on her shoulder, like the universe reaching out and saying, "Wait. Not yet, you need to see this." She froze mid-step on the mezzanine stairs, one hand on the brass railing, the other holding her empty champagne glass that slipped from her fingers would have fallen and shattered on the marble below if Rachel hadn't been right there, catching it with reflexes born of 3 years of preventing disasters. The melody wrapped around Sophia like a ghost's embrace, like someone she'd loved and lost, reaching across 16 years to touch her again. She gripped the brass railing with both hands, now knuckles going white with pressure, the world tilting around her as the melody pulled her back through time and space to a summer night that had defined everything that came after. She was 18 again, sitting cross-legged on weathered wood of a dock over Lake Mendota in Wisconsin. Stars overhead so bright they seemed close enough to touch the Milky Way, a river of light cutting across the darkness. Dominic beside her with his wild confidence and passionate eyes, his fingers dancing over the keys of a portable keyboard, his voice soft with emotion he could feel but couldn't quite articulate. I'm calling it Midnight Sonata. It holds everything I feel but can't say, everything I want to give you but don't have words for. Everything we could be together if you'll just trust me. She'd cried that night, happy tears that tasted like salt and wonder, the kind of tears that came from being seen and loved and chosen by someone who seemed to understand her better than she understood herself. She'd kissed him under those impossible stars, believed with her entire 18-year-old heart that this was the beginning of forever, that she'd found the one person who would never leave her the way her mother had left aneurysm in the garden between the roses and the tulips dead before the ambulance arrived. 3 weeks later, police officers on her parents' doorstep, Miss Lancaster. There's been an accident. Dominic Vale struck a tree during heavy rain on Route 12. He was pronounced dead at the scene. We're so very sorry for your loss. The song had become her lifeline through everything that followed. Her mother's death anniversary every spring when the roses bloomed. Her father's transformation into someone cold and calculating who saw emotions as weaknesses to be eliminated. Every board meeting where she had to prove herself twice as hard because she was a woman in a male-dominated field. Every lonely night in her penthouse when the silence became so heavy, she could barely breathe. She'd played it in her head during moments when she needed to remember that once briefly she'd been loved for who she was, rather than what she could provide. But she'd never heard it played out loud again, never sought recordings because there weren't any. Dominic had never written it down, never performed it publicly. It existed only in her memory and in that terrible quality phone recording she'd made that night on the dock. But now someone else was playing it. Every note, every pause, every aching phrase exactly as Dominic had played it 16 years ago. The same tempo, the same dynamics, the same subtle rubato in the second verse that made the melody breathe. Everything exactly right, exactly perfect, exactly impossible. Her vision blurred as tears filled her eyes and spilled over, running down her cheeks and ruining the makeup that had taken 40 minutes that morning, creating tracks through foundation and mascara that she didn't care about, didn't even notice. Around her, guests murmured appreciation. That's beautiful. Who is that playing? Didn't know janitors could play like that. Someone record this, completely oblivious to the fact that Sophia Lancaster's carefully constructed world had just been torn apart at the seams. How could this stranger, this janitor she'd defended an hour ago, whose name she barely remembered, know? Dominic's song, the song that Dominic had written just for her. the song that no one else knew, the song that had died with him on that rain-slicked highway. How was this possible? She descended the stairs on legs that didn't quite work right, drawn toward the piano like someone magnetized, like metal pulled toward lodestone, like a ship pulled toward shore. The crowd parted to let her through without quite knowing why, responding to something in her face or her body language or the intensity of her need to get to the piano to see who was playing, to understand what was happening. Elijah finished the piece. The final notes hung in the air like incense smoke, fading slowly into silence that felt holy, somehow sacred, like the moment after a prayer when you're waiting to see if God will answer. He opened his eyes and found the CEO standing 3 feet away. Her face was pale, bloodless, like she'd seen a ghost or received terrible news or had some fundamental truth shattered. Her ice blue eyes were swimming with tears that made them look more gray than blue, made them look human instead of calculating. Her chest rose and fell with breaths that seemed to cost her something, that seemed to require deliberate effort. Her hands were shaking. Sophia Lancaster, who commanded boardrooms and made grown men nervous, who projected competence and control in every interaction, was standing in her lobby with tears streaming down her face and her hands shaking and her voice barely above a whisper when she finally spoke. "Where did you learn that?" The question came out raw, scraped like something pulled from deep inside her chest, where she kept all the things she didn't let herself feel during business hours. Elijah stood slowly from the piano bench, his heart hammering against his ribs hard enough that he could feel it in his throat, in his temples, in his damaged right hand, that was suddenly shaking for reasons that had nothing to do with nerve damage. He'd known this moment might come someday, had dreaded it and longed for it in equal measure through all the years since he'd given the song to Dominic, through all the years since Dominic had died and the song had become Sophia's grief made manifest. But knowing a moment might come and being prepared for it when it actually arrives are two entirely different things. "It's just an old melody, ma'am." He kept his voice level, respectful, the way maintenance staff spoke to CEOs, the way the invisible spoke to the powerful. "Something I picked up years ago, I don't remember where exactly." "Don't." Her voice cracked on the word. "Don't lie to me. Not about this." She stepped closer, searching his face with an intensity that felt invasive, that felt like she was trying to see through his skin to whatever truth was hiding underneath. "That song was written for me by someone who died 16 years ago. No one else knew it. No one else could have known it. I never shared it. He never recorded it. It existed between us alone, between him and me, and then he died and the song died with him." Her voice was rising now, control slipping, emotion bleeding through the cracks in her CEO armor. "So I need you to tell me right now. No lies, no evasions, no polite maintenance worker deference. Where did you learn that song? How do you know it? Who taught it to you?" Before Elijah could formulate an answer, before he could figure out what to say or whether to tell the truth, or how to explain 16 years of silence without making it worse, Maya appeared at his side, sleepy and smiling, rubbing her eyes with small fists, the hot chocolate and cookies settling warm in her stomach, ready to go home to their apartment and their electronic keyboard and the bedtime routine that made her feel safe. "That was beautiful, Daddy, just like Mommy used to say. She said you played like you were talking to God. Can we go home now? I'm sleepy." Sophia's gaze dropped to the child, then back to Elijah. She saw the fear in his eyes now. Not fear of her exactly, but fear of something, fear that made him move slightly to position himself between her and his daughter. Not aggressive, but protective, the way you position yourself when you're not sure if someone is safe. She saw him making rapid calculations, whether this woman was a threat, whether he needed to get Maya out of here, whether everything was about to fall apart. She forced herself to breathe, to step back, to remember where she was and who was watching. 400 employees with phones out, Rachel hovering nearby with concern written across her face. Garrett at the bar, watching this interaction with narrow eyes that promised future questions. Whatever this was, whatever impossible thing had just happened, it couldn't be resolved here, not now. Not in front of witnesses who would turn it into gossip that would spread through the company like wildfire. Of course. Sophia's voice steadied, CEO mask sliding back into place with visible effort, like someone putting on armor that didn't quite fit anymore. Thank you for playing. It was beautiful. The word felt inadequate, felt like calling the ocean wet or the sun bright, but it was all she could manage without her voice breaking completely. Elijah gathered Maya's coat from where it was draped over a chair, helped her into it with gentle efficiency born of 3 years of being the only parent. Kept himself between his daughter and Sophia, not obvious about it, just carefully positioned. As he walked toward the exit, Maya turned and waved with innocent enthusiasm. Goodbye, nice piano lady. Thank you for the cookies and the pretty bandages. Sophia couldn't wave back, could only stand there rooted to the marble floor while 400 people pretended not to stare, and the melody still echoed in her skull like a hymn or a curse or a question that demanded answering. The elevator doors closed behind them, father and daughter disappearing into the night, into whatever life they lived beyond this building, beyond her knowledge, beyond her reach. Sophia stood alone in a lobby full of people, feeling more isolated than she'd felt in 16 years. Feeling like the ground had just opened beneath her feet and she was falling into something she didn't understand and couldn't control. And for the first time since her mother died, since Dominic died, since she'd learned to freeze her emotions and channel everything into quarterly projections and acquisition targets, Sophia Lancaster felt the careful control she'd built around her grief begin to crack like ice in spring. The party continued around her, people laughing, drinking, performing their assigned roles in the social machinery. But she couldn't hear it anymore, couldn't focus on it, couldn't care about it. All she could hear was the melody still playing in her head. The song that should have died with Dominic, but apparently hadn't, the impossible fact of its existence in the hands of a janitor who shouldn't know it, who couldn't know it, who had just torn apart 16 years of carefully maintained grief with 8 minutes of playing. She climbed back up to the mezzanine on legs that felt like they belonged to someone else, picked up a fresh glass of champagne that Rachel silently provided. Stood at the railing looking down at the party, but she wasn't seeing any of it. She was 18 again, sitting on a dock under impossible stars, believing in love and music and forever. And she was 34, standing in her own building, watching everything she thought she knew about her past dissolve like salt in water. Sophia didn't sleep that night. She tried, went through all the motions that usually worked. Returned to her penthouse at 11:47 p.m., changed out of the crimson dress, removed makeup with the mechanical efficiency of routine established over years. Brushed teeth, set phone on nightstand, took Ambien, turned on white noise machine, adjusted temperature to optimal 68 degrees. Lay in bed staring at ceiling while Chicago's lights painted moving shadows across walls. Every time she closed her eyes, she saw Dominic's face, heard his voice promising her forever in notes instead of words. Felt his lips on hers under impossible Wisconsin stars. But now another image kept intruding, disrupting the memory she'd carefully preserved for 16 years like a specimen in amber. The janitor's scarred hands moving across piano keys with grace that shouldn't be possible. The way his whole body swayed with the music like he was physically connected to every note. The sorrow etched into lines around his eyes, not fresh grief, but the old kind, the worn, smooth kind that came from carrying loss so long it became part of your skeleton. The way he'd held his daughter like she was the only thing in the world worth protecting. At 3:17 a.m., she gave up on sleep, made coffee, stood at her floor-to-ceiling windows watching the city that never quite went dark. Delivery trucks, street cleaners, the homeless finding doorways, a different Chicago than the one that existed during business hours. At 5:30 a.m., she called Rachel. "I need you in the office early." Rachel's voice was thick with sleep. "How early?" "Now." To her credit, Rachel didn't argue, didn't ask questions. "Give me 40 minutes. Sophia arrived at Lancaster Tower at 6:03 a.m. The lobby was dark except for emergency lighting. The cleaning crew had finished hours ago. Security nodded her through with the tired courtesy of people working overnight shifts who'd learned not to ask questions about why executives showed up at odd hours. She took the elevator to 60, her office, corner suite with views of the lake turning gray in pre-dawn light, and the skyline beginning to distinguish itself from darkness. Pulled Elijah Cross's employee file before Rachel even arrived. The information was sparse, deliberately so, like someone trying to leave as small a footprint as possible, like someone who'd learned to be invisible. Elijah Cross, age 36, hired September 14, 2022, 3 years, 3 months ago. Position maintenance technician level 2, salary $42,000 annually. No college degree listed. Previous employment, Midwest distribution warehouse worker, March 2018 to August 2022. Save Mart grocery stock clerk, June 2015, February 2018, various odd jobs before that. Emergency contact, Maya Cross, age 7, daughter, relationship, father. No spouse or partner listed currently. That was it. No mention of music, no conservatory training. No explanation for how someone stocking grocery shelves and fixing toilets could play piano like that, could play a song that shouldn't exist outside her memories. Rachel arrived at 6:44 a.m., hair still damp from a quick shower, minimal makeup. First time Sophia had seen her looking anything less than perfectly put together. "What do you need, boss?" "Background check on Elijah Cross, everything we have. Previous employment verification, references, everything." Rachel's fingers flew across her tablet. "Give me 20 minutes. She was back in 15 because Rachel was good at her job and knew when Sophia was serious versus when she was just being thorough. Not much here beyond what's in his employee file. Background check came back clean, no criminal record, no civil judgments, no restraining orders. Credit score is not great. 542. Significant medical debt. Looks like cancer treatment bills based on the billing codes I can see, but they're not for him. For who? To Naomi Cross. Same address as Elijah. Medical claims 2019 through 2022. Oncology codes, radiation therapy, chemotherapy, looks like breast cancer based on the procedure codes. Final claim was April 7, 2022. Then nothing. She's not listed as emergency contact anymore, not listed as resident at the address. If I had to guess based on the pattern, she died. Yeah, most likely. The pieces were starting to form a picture. Not a clear one, but something. Man with musical talent works minimum wage jobs. Wife gets cancer, medical debt piles up despite insurance. Wife dies. Man takes whatever job offers decent health insurance for his daughter, hides his talent because broken dreams hurt less when you don't talk about them. But it still didn't explain the song. What about the gap? Sophia pointed at the screen. 2011 to 2018, 7 years, no employment record. Rachel scrolled through databases. Nothing official. No tax returns filed in Illinois those years. Might have been in another state, might have been working cash jobs, might have been, I don't know. Disappeared from the system somehow. 7 years. The kind of gap that spoke of something catastrophic. Prison. Hospitalization. Fleeing something or someone. or rebuilding yourself from scratch after everything fell apart. Anything else? One thing, small detail might be nothing. Rachel pulled up another screen. His hire date, September 14th, 2022. That's 5 months after the last medical claim for Naomi Cross. 5 months after she presumably died. He would have needed new health insurance, needed stable employment, needed to take care of his daughter. Yeah. Sophia stared at the file for a long moment. At the photograph clipped to the inside cover, Elijah's employee ID photo. Professional, neutral expression, but his eyes held something the camera had captured even if it couldn't define it. Sorrow, old and deep and carefully controlled. I need to find him. Rachel looked up from her tablet. Boss, he'll be back at work on the 26th. You can just... No, I need to find him now, before he runs. Why would he run? Sophia set down the file, met her assistant's eyes. Because I would. If I'd been invisible for 16 years and someone suddenly saw me, really saw me, I'd run. At 8:00 a.m., Sophia called a number she hadn't used in over a decade. Dr. Lawrence Ashford, professor of music at Wisconsin Music Conservatory, retired now, but still living in Madison according to the online directory that listed him, with the kind of detail that suggested he was old school about privacy, that he'd never quite understood why you wouldn't want people to be able to find you. The phone rang 4 times. Sophia had almost resigned herself to voicemail when he picked up. Ashford residence. Dr. Ashford, this is Sophia Lancaster. I don't know if you remember me. Of course I remember you, Sophia. His voice was warm, exactly as she remembered from those brief conversations 16 years ago when he'd been Dominic's mentor. And she'd been the grieving girlfriend trying to understand what had been lost. You were at music camp in 2008. You were dating Dominic Vale. I'm so terribly sorry for your loss. Such a talented young man, such a tragedy. Thank you. Actually, that's why I'm calling. I need to ask you about that summer, about Dominic, about a song he wrote. Midnight Sonata. Her heart stopped. You remember it? Of course. Dominic worked on it for weeks, obsessed over it. It was one of his finest compositions. Why do you ask? Because someone played it last night, someone who shouldn't know it, and I need to understand how that's possible. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. The kind of pause that spoke of secrets kept and guilt accumulated and decisions made long ago that still haunted. Sophia, where are you? Can you come to Madison? Why can't you just tell me over the phone? This is a conversation that needs to happen in person. Please, it's important. She checked her calendar. Meetings, conference calls, a board presentation she'd been preparing for weeks. I can be there by 2 o'clock. I'll make tea. The drive to Madison took 2 hours and 37 minutes. Sophia drove in silence, no radio, no podcasts, no calls, just the hum of tires on highway and the sound of her own thoughts spiraling through 16 years of memories that might not be memories at all, but elaborate constructions built on false foundations. Dr. Ashford's house was a small cottage on the outskirts of town. White clapboard with blue shutters and a garden that had been put to bed for winter, but still showed signs of careful tending through spring, summer, and fall. The kind of place that spoke of someone who valued beauty over display, who found meaning in small rituals like weeding and watering and watching things grow. He met her at the door, looking older than she remembered, 63 now. White hair gone mostly silver, wire-rimmed glasses, tweed jacket with leather elbow patches like he'd stepped out of central casting for small-town music professor. Sophia, you look well, successful. Thank you for seeing me on such short notice. Of course. Come in. The inside of the house was exactly what she'd expected. Books everywhere, shelves covering every wall, stacks on tables and chairs and the floor. A piano in the living room, well-maintained Yamaha upright. Sheet music on stands. Photographs on the walls showing students' performances, moments of achievement and pride accumulated over 4 decades of teaching. They sat in a small study. Dr. Ashford poured tea from a pot that looked older than Sophia Earl Grey, that reminded her of her mother who used to make it before the aneurysm. "Tell me what happened," he said simply. So Sophia told him. About the Christmas party. About the janitor who played Midnight Sonata note perfect. About the impossibility of it, the way it couldn't exist outside her memories and Dominic's recording that had burned in the car with him. Dr. Ashford listened without interrupting. When she finished, he was quiet for a long moment, staring into his teacup like it might contain answers. Then, "Sophia, I need to tell you something. Something I should have told you 16 years ago but didn't because I thought it would hurt you more than help. Because I was a coward who prioritized a dead student's reputation over a living student's truth." His hands shook slightly as he set down his teacup. Dominic didn't write Midnight Sonata, not all of it. The words landed like a physical blow, like someone had punched her in the chest and driven all the air from her lungs. What? He wrote the opening, the first 8 bars. Beautiful work, he had a real gift for melody. But he got stuck. Couldn't figure out where to take it, couldn't find the resolution, couldn't make it work the way he heard it in his head. I watched him struggle with it for 2 weeks. He'd write something, hate it, crumple the paper, start over. Spent hours at the piano trying different approaches, different harmonies, different directions. Nothing worked. Dr. Ashford removed his glasses, rubbed his eyes with thumb and forefinger. Looking older, looking tired, looking like someone carrying weight for too long. There was another student that summer, scholarship kid, quiet, kept to himself, worked in the cafeteria washing dishes to earn his keep because the scholarship only covered tuition, not room or board or any of the incidental costs. From a poor family, I remember that much. His father had died recently, mother cleaned houses, sister needed dental work they couldn't afford. Sophia's hands gripped the teacup so hard, she was surprised it didn't shatter. Dominic felt guilty about having so much when others had so little. His family wasn't wealthy, but compared to this kid, they were rich. So he befriended him, brought him leftovers from the dining hall, let him use the practice rooms during off hours, and when he got stuck on Midnight Sonata, he asked this kid for help. What happened? The kid listened to what Dominic had, those 8 bars, went away for 2 days, came back with it completed, turned that fragment into something extraordinary, the kind of composition that comes once in a lifetime if you're lucky. Sophia felt tears burning behind her eyes, felt her entire understanding of the past 16 years dissolving like salt in water. And Dominic took credit. Dominic wanted to tell you the truth. I know that for certain because he came to me about it, asked for advice about what to do, but the other student said no. Said you deserved to have something beautiful from someone who belonged in your world, someone who could give it to you properly. Dr. Ashford put his glasses back on, looked at her directly. I never corrected the record after Dominic died. Never told anyone that Midnight Sonata was a collaboration, that the best part, the part that made it transcendent instead of merely good, came from someone else. I told myself it was to honor Dominic's memory, but really I was protecting his reputation, protecting my own pride in having taught him, protecting the narrative that made him seem like the genius I wanted him to be. Who was the other student? Do you remember his name? Dr. Ashford stood, walked to a filing cabinet, pulled out old records yellowed with age, flipped through pages of student rosters and scholarship recipients and work-study assignments. Summer 2008. Here, Elijah Cross, age 20, piano, full scholarship recipient, work-study assignment, cafeteria services, midnight to 6 a.m. shift. recommended by his high school music teacher in Chicago. Showed great promise. Withdrew from program after one summer, reason not given. He looked up at Sophia with something like sorrow in his eyes. The man who played last night, his name was Elijah Cross, wasn't it? Sophia couldn't speak, could only nod. Do you have a photo? She pulled out her phone with shaking hands, showed him the employee ID photo that Rachel had sent her. Dr. Ashford studied it for a long moment, eyes moving across the pixelated features like he was trying to see through 16 years of age and experience to the 20-year-old kid who'd washed dishes at 3 in the morning. Then he nodded slowly, certainty replacing doubt. Yes, that's him. Older, obviously, but yes, that's the student who completed Midnight Sonata. Sophia called the maintenance department at 8:17 a.m. the next morning, December 26th, as soon as she knew the supervisor would be in. Frank Martinez answered on the second ring. Maintenance, this is Frank. This is Sophia Lancaster. I need to speak with Elijah Cross. Is he working today? There was a pause, the kind of pause that immediately made her stomach drop. No, ma'am. He called in sick this morning, said it was a family matter, first time he's called in sick in 3 years, so I approved it without question. What about tomorrow? He requested personal days through the end of the week. Through January 2nd, actually. Submitted the request yesterday afternoon, said it was urgent. He's got the banked time, hasn't taken a sick day or vacation day since he started. So I approved it. Is there a problem? 3 days ago. He'd submitted the request 3 days ago. That was before the Christmas party, before she'd heard him play, before any of this happened. He'd already been planning to disappear. Did he say what the family matter was? No, ma'am, and I didn't ask. Company policy is that we don't interrogate employees about their personal time as long as they're not abusing the system, and Cross has never abused anything. He's one of our best workers, reliable, skilled, never complains. Is there something I should know? No, no problem. Thank you, Frank. She hung up, looked at Rachel, who'd been listening to the call on speaker. He's running. You don't know that, boss. Maybe his daughter is actually sick. Maybe there really is a family emergency. He's running. Sophia's certainty was absolute, bone deep, the kind of knowing that came from recognizing yourself in someone else's behavior. I need his home address. Rachel pulled it up on her tablet, turned the screen toward Sophia. 2247 South Halsted Street. Apartment 3C, Chicago IL 60608, South Side. Not a great neighborhood based on the zip code, not the worst Chicago had to offer, but not somewhere you'd choose to live if you had better options. Sophia stood, grabbed her coat. I'm going there. Boss, you can't just show up at an employee's home address unannounced. There are policies, HR concerns. If he files a complaint about harassment, then I'll deal with it. But I'm not letting him vanish. She was in her car, black Mercedes S-Class that she barely drove because parking in Chicago was a nightmare. And she usually took car service by 9:03 a.m. GPS said 23 minutes in current traffic. She made it in 18, driving with the kind of focused intensity that made other drivers nervous, changing lanes. Without signaling, taking risks she'd normally never take, motivated by fear that she couldn't quite name, but felt in her chest like pressure. The building was exactly what she'd expected based on the neighborhood. 4 stories of brown brick that had once been red but had faded under decades of Chicago weather and pollution. Fire escapes zigzagging down the front like scars on skin, windows with bars, not decorative wrought iron but functional security bars that spoke of break-ins and property crime and the economics of poverty. A front door that should have required a key or buzzer but didn't because the lock mechanism was broken and nobody had fixed it and probably wouldn't fix it unless the city issued a violation. She climbed to the 3rd floor, found apartment 3C, knocked. No answer. She knocked again, harder, using the side of her fist to make it clear this wasn't casual. Still nothing. The door across the hall opened a crack. An elderly black woman peered out, suspicious, protective of her neighbors even when those neighbors weren't home. "They're gone." Sophia turned. "Excuse me. The Crosses, Elijah and little Maya, they left 3 days ago, early morning right before dawn. Just a couple of suitcases, not much else." 3 days ago. Before the party. Before everything. Did he say where they were going? The woman shook her head, the chain on her door catching the light. "None of my business where people go. But I heard Maya crying. Heard her say she didn't want to go on an adventure, she wanted to stay home. Elijah told her it would be okay, told her they'd be back soon, but..." The woman hesitated. "He looked scared, honey. Like he was running from something bad or running to protect her from something, hard to tell which." Sophia felt panic claw at her chest, felt control slipping like sand through fingers. Did he leave a forwarding address, mail? Forwarding anything? "Wouldn't tell you if he had. Don't know you. Could be anybody. Could be the reason he ran." Fair enough. Reasonable even. Sophia thanked her, turned away before the woman could ask questions she couldn't answer. Went back downstairs to find the building manager's office, a cramped room that smelled of cigarettes and old coffee, and the particular staleness of air that hasn't been refreshed in years. The manager was a white man in his 50s with the resigned exhaustion of someone who'd given up on most things years ago. "I'm looking for Elijah Cross, apartment 3C. He moved out, paid through the end of the month like the lease required, left the place clean, that's all I know." "Did he leave a forwarding address?" "No." "Did he say anything about where he was going? Why he was leaving?" "Lady, I don't interrogate my tenants. He paid his rent on time, he kept his place clean, he didn't cause problems, that's all I cared about. Where he goes after leaving is his business." "Can you at least tell me when his lease was up?" "Month to month. Has been for 2 years. He could leave any time with 30 days' notice, which he gave, so we're square." Dead end. Complete dead end. Sophia drove back to the office feeling like the ground was shifting under her feet, like everything solid had turned to quicksand, like she was drowning in questions that had no answers. Elijah Cross had disappeared. Completely. Taking his daughter and whatever secrets he carried with him into whatever hiding place he'd found, and she had no idea how to find him, how to get answers, how to understand what had happened. Christmas Eve, when a janitor played a song that shouldn't exist and shattered 16 years of carefully maintained grief. Martin Reeves came highly recommended. 58 years old, former FBI, 23 years in the Bureau before retiring to private investigation work. The kind of man who could find anyone who specialized in skip traces and missing persons and people who didn't want to be found. He came to her office the next afternoon, listened to her explanation without taking notes, because he had the kind of memory that didn't need them. "I need you to find someone. Elijah Cross, 36 years old, has a 7-year-old daughter named Maya. Last known address was South Halsted, but he moved out 3 days ago. No forwarding address, I need to know where he is." Reeves studied her with eyes that had seen too much to be impressed by wealth or position. "Can I ask why this personal or professional? Does it matter? It matters for how I approach the search and how I bill you and whether I'm comfortable taking the case. I don't do stalking cases, don't help people find ex-partners who left for good reason, don't participate in harassment disguised as legitimate inquiry." Fair question, legitimate concern. It's about a song. He played something that I thought was written by someone who died 16 years ago. I need to understand how he knows it, that's all. No ulterior motives. Reeves considered this, decided it passed whatever ethical threshold he maintained. Standard rate is $300 per hour plus expenses. I'll start with the easy stuff: credit cards, cell phone, DMV records, social media. If that doesn't work, I'll get creative. Give me 72 hours. He was back in 64 hours with nothing. No credit card activity under Elijah Cross or Maya Cross anywhere in the country since December 23rd. Last transaction was a gas station on Route 41, but the card hasn't been used since. No cell phone activity. Looks like he either turned it off or ditched it because the last ping was from a tower near his old apartment 3 days ago. No DMV records showing vehicle registration in his name. No social media presence that I can find. No flight bookings, no bus tickets, no car rentals, no hotel reservations under either name. How is that possible? You can't just vanish in 2024. There are cameras everywhere, digital trails everywhere. You can if you know how. Reeves leaned back in his chair. Cash-only transactions. Burner phone or no phone. Friend's place or cheap motel that doesn't check ID too carefully. Could be anywhere within 500 miles. Could be in the apartment next door using a fake name. This guy knows how to be invisible, which suggests either prior experience disappearing or serious motivation to stay hidden. So you can't find him. I didn't say that. I said it'll take longer and cost more. I can canvass homeless shelters, check low-rent motels, run facial recognition on traffic cameras if you want to get into legally gray territory. But Ms. Lancaster, I need you to understand. If someone really wants to disappear in this country, if they're willing to go without modern conveniences and live off the grid, they can. Especially if they don't have much anchoring them to begin with. No mortgage, no car payments, just a daughter and enough cash to get by for a while. For 2 weeks, Sophia paid Reeves to search. Paid him to check every shelter, every cheap motel, every place someone might hide with a 7-year-old child. Nothing. Elijah and Maya Cross had vanished as completely as if they'd never existed. Every evening for those 2 weeks, Sophia stayed late at the office. Long after everyone else had gone home, long after security had made their rounds, long after the building had settled into its nighttime rhythms of creaks and hums and the specific silence of empty spaces designed for thousands. She would walk through the empty lobby, stand by the piano, run her fingers over the keys without pressing them hard enough to make sound, waiting for what she couldn't quite articulate. For him to come back, for answers to materialize from nothing, for the universe to make sense again, but mostly just waiting because it was better than going home to her empty penthouse, where the silence was so heavy she could barely breathe under its weight. On the 14th night, January 8th, 2025 at 12:37 a.m. According to her phone, when she checked it after she descended from her office, drawn by something she couldn't name. Instinct, maybe, or hope, or the kind of magical thinking that grief and confusion can produce. The elevator doors opened onto the lobby. Elijah Cross sat at the piano, not playing, just sitting, his scarred right hand resting on the closed fallboard, his head bowed like a man in prayer or preparing for confession or gathering courage for something difficult. He was here, real, solid. Not a ghost or a hallucination or wishful thinking made manifest. Sophia's heels clicked on marble as she walked toward him, the sound echoing in the vast empty space announcing her presence. Elijah didn't turn around, but his shoulders tensed, muscles tightening in a way that suggested he'd known she was there, had perhaps been waiting for her, had maybe even hoped she'd come. She stopped 10 feet away, close enough to speak normally. Far enough to give him space to run if he chose to maintain some pretense of professional distance, to not crowd him into feeling cornered. "You came back." His voice emerged quiet when he finally spoke, resigned, tired, like someone who'd spent 2 weeks running and had finally decided to stop. "I shouldn't have run in the first place. Why did you?" Now he turned, pivoting on the piano bench to face her, his gray-green eyes meeting her ice-blue ones with a directness that felt brave or reckless or both. "Because Maya asked me why we left, why we were sleeping in a motel in Indiana, why we couldn't go back to our apartment, to her school, to her friends. and I couldn't give her a good answer that made sense to a 7-year-old. He stood slowly, deliberately, like his body hurt, or he was just tired beyond measure. She liked it here, liked the cookies your assistant gave her, liked watching the Christmas lights, like the nice lady CEO who stood up for us when that man was mean. She said running away from nice people was wrong, and she's 7 years old and somehow smarter than her 36-year-old father. Where is she now? Motel 6 blocks from here. Neighbor's daughter is watching her for $20 and the promise I'd be back in an hour. I needed... He trailed off, gestured vaguely at the piano. I needed to explain, or try to. You deserve that much. Sophia moved closer, closing half the distance between them. I went to Dr. Ashford. He told me about the song, about how Dominic didn't finish it, about the scholarship student who completed it. She saw Elijah's jaw clench, saw his hands curl into fists and then deliberately relax. Was it you? The question hung between them for a long moment. Then Elijah nodded slowly. Yes, it was me. And with that single word, 16 years of carefully maintained grief collapsed like a building whose foundation had turned to sand.